You're welcome. You're still watching the Business Day television breakfast show. And right now on the big story, we're talking about leveraging ethos, culture to drive national development. And we're being joined by Oyinkan. She is a researcher and policy expert. Good morning, Oyinkan Teriba.
Good morning.
Hello, good morning once again, and welcome to the big story on the BDTV breakfast show. I am Destiny Momoh. This morning, we are taking a step back to ask ourselves a deeper question: who are we as Nigerians, and how does that identity actually shape the way we grow as a nation? Too often development is framed in terms of infrastructure, technology, or even economic policies. But then again, culture, our values, our ways of living, and even our shared ethos is just as critical. Our guest today, Oyinkan Teriba, wrote a thought-provoking piece in Business Day on how reclaiming Nigeria's ethos could become a real engine for national development. She argues that until we reconnect with our values and identity, our growth will always feel incomplete. Welcome to the show, Oyinkan.
Thank you.
So good to have you join us this morning. I hope the rain wasn't so much of a hindrance for you.
No, it's okay.
Thank you once again. So now, Oyinkan, in your article, you spoke about Nigeria's need to reclaim its ethos. Can you hear me? All right then. Okay, now for those hearing this conversation for the first time, what does that really mean?
Well, I think it's asking ourselves the question in the most simple terms of why are we trying to grow? What is the end goal? And why are we doing that with the same people that we're doing it within this landmass called Nigeria? And I think that's a deep philosophical question that every society has to ask itself at some stage. In the article, I talked about the Protestant ethic. So that's the kind of driving force behind European development. And then I also talked about the Confucian ethic, which is the values of Confucianism, which are really part of cultural practice, not just in China, but across the eastern, southeastern part of Asia. And in the Nigerian context, we are in a moment where we're seeing increasing sort of a rise in sort of ethno-politics and tribalism. We're also seeing a sense of listlessness about what it is that we're driving towards. We want to bring people out of poverty, but that's not just because we want better statistics, it's actually because we want to enrich the lives that we share together in Nigeria. And so that's the reason I think it's important to ask this question. But I also think that exercise involves a lot of soul searching as to how we build that national identity. It doesn't need to displace any of our ethnic identities or other communities, but rather one that's capacious enough to sort of hold all Nigerians in their beautiful diversity.
But then again, many of us think of culture as festivals, music, or even movies. But you place it at the center of national development. So why do you believe culture is such a powerful driver of progress?
Well, I think it's a more recent thing to think of culture simply as what happens in art galleries, and what happens at the time of festivals. But actually, if you kind of look into what the real grounding of the term culture is, it's an interaction between our traditions, so those kind of practices that are recognizable to us, but also how we live our day-to-day lives and how that structures our day-to-day lives. So cultural practice is things like the way on a day-to-day basis Nigerians tend to be deferent to elders, and how we revere and value wisdom, and how we have a really strong sense of familial responsibility. And so many of us work and send remittances, not just people who go abroad, but also people who are inside Nigeria. And so what I'm arguing for here is a conception of culture that really takes into account not just the nice stuff that we get to pay for and go for as festivals, but also takes into account how we as a society define ourselves and also how we place ourselves in the world. And I think that's a more fundamental question. So that's what kind of reward systems do we have in our society, and how do we think about morality? Those are the kind of cultural questions that I think Nigeria needs to kind of bring to the fore.
Wow, really nice. But then, okay, Nigeria is a country of over 250 ethnic groups. And sometimes, this diversity, it feels more divisive than unifying. So, how can a shared national ethos actually bring us together without erasing those differences?
Yeah, I was trying to sort of argue a really straight up position in the article, and so there were parts of the article that I was unfortunately unable to include. And I think there's really a beautiful kind of story here, because it's not simply that Nigerians have always been divided and that we've never had any moments where we as a society have galvanized ourselves to be able to pursue our development goals. Actually, my grandfather was of the generation of Nigerians who would travel abroad,
Okay.
go and get an education, get qualifications, and come back to Nigeria and commit their kind of portion to national development, right?
Mm.
And so in recent years, I really pinned this sense of a fracture in Nigerian society around ethnic questions and diversity down to a misconception that in order to be Nigerian, you can't also be Yoruba or Igbo or Efik or Hausa, right?
Mm.
Actually, those two identities can coexist. So as a nation, what is our purpose? And then we also, within our smaller subgroups, have like shared cultural identity, shared traditions, but that doesn't need to displace. And there's really a cosmopolitan approach to identity that I'm advocating for. And crucially, that's not unique to Nigeria. China has hundreds of ethnic identities, though obviously there's a dominant major group. In Europe, many of the European countries today that we see as one ethnic group have over time assimilated into a collective identity. In the UK, where I grew up, you have England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, all with distinct identities and cultures, but they also collectively share a culture, a national culture, which drives them towards development. And so that's really what I'm advocating for. It's not to displace our own local identities, but rather to find a way to make them cohere. I think making them cohere will give us a sense of purpose, and also renew our commitment and patriotism towards the Nigerian cause. It's strange, interestingly, in this moment, sorry, I'll wrap up very quickly, but I have a lot of friends from China and other parts of the world who are developing, and many of them will go abroad and study, and their mind is always geared towards even their research topics. How am I going to improve my home? Oh. Whereas in this moment, we kind of have this wave of Japa where people are looking to study but get out, and all the energy and the effort that Nigeria has put into educating them is given to other countries. And I think part of that is because there's not really that sense of national belonging.
Wow, that's a strong point out there. But then you also highlighted in your piece how our creative industries have become global forces, yet we don't always link them to nation building. So then, what are we overlooking in terms of economic potential?
There's huge economic potential here. I mean, Nigeria is hot at the moment. Everybody wants a piece of Nigerian culture, and I think definitely our cultural practices are beginning to dominate, not just on the continent, but even beyond, whether you're talking about fashion, film and cinema, whether you're talking about sports, right?
Right.
But we're missing a trick in terms of really creating that sense of belonging so that we can package that, and so we can take ownership of our cultural identity, and also so that we can use it as an opportunity to educate the world, which oftentimes has sometimes quite colonial or backwards ideas of what being a Nigerian is or what being an African is, right? And so I think in terms of economic potential, there's huge. The global entertainment industry is worth billions of dollars, and just getting a piece of that pie, I think, is also going to contribute to our development goals.
Wow. You said something striking before now when you talked about, Nigeria, actually educating, a lot of minds, and then the Japa syndrome taking over from, taking all that goodness away and enjoying it. It actually really strikes something. I mean, it strikes a chord there. So, what do you think will be ways, for these values to return back to this nation?
I think there are two really key areas that we need to focus on as a nation. I was really excited yesterday to see an announcement from the Ministry of Education that history is making its way back into the compulsory curriculum from primary one all the way through to JSS3. I think those early formative years are really the years in which countries invest in building that sense of national identity among their young people. And that generation of young people then goes on to be the people who govern the nation, but also the people who operate as captains of industry and drive development. So I think number one is making sure that Nigerian children and the younger generation understand where we're coming from, where we are at the moment, and where we want to go as a nation. And then I think the second area is really taking a look at our incentive structures as a society. What kinds of behaviors do we incentivize? Do we incentivize our companies to invest in research and development that caters specifically to Nigerian tastes? Okay. Do we incentivize our educators, our researchers to focus on Nigerian topics? And a lot of researchers are, at the moment kind of doing this bridging divide where they're looking for opportunities to go abroad and think about what's happening elsewhere. But how do we draw our attention back to home? And how do we weave that story together? So I think there's so many different sectors of the society that can play a role in this, but it really needs that strategic kind of direction that's coming from the top, from the federal government level, state government level, and local government level. That's investment in museums and sense-making, storytelling, but also investment in building Nigeria as a kind of market that caters to specifically Nigerians as well.
Oh, wow. You also highlighted in your piece how our creative industries have become global forces, yet we don't always link them to nation building. So what are we overlooking in terms of economic potential?
I think until you answer these fundamental questions,
okay,
that sense of purpose is missing.
Sure.
In China, people, as I talk about in the article, people connect their love for their home and their love for their families to their love for the nation. And that patriotism emanates from the sense of responsibility that you have to your families. I think that kind of dynamic is a bit disconnected in the Nigerian context. Okay. But what comes out of that is the 996 culture. What comes out of that is the willingness of Chinese people to make sacrifices for national progress, is the sense of kind of disgust when you see people acting in their own interest, but out of the interests of the nation as a whole, right? So I think that the economic potential that we're talking about here is in part some of the kind of bread and butter in terms of our cultural exports, which is a huge market that's low capital and not capital intensive, right? But then also the potential of a determined people. Development is not something that happens by accident. It's not something that you stumble into. It's actually a work and a slog. Every nation that has developed has gone through difficult times. And to be able to find those cultural resources to draw on, to motivate our people to pass through some of the struggles that we're dealing with at the moment, whether it's hiking prices, whether it's the kind of rollback on subsidies in order to create fiscal space for spending on human development, all of these things require us to have that sense of purpose. And I think that's the core economic bit that we're missing.
All right, then. Okay, now let's talk values now. Do you see a direct connection between the cultural values we embrace and the kind of governance or even leadership we end up with?
Absolutely. I think there's two dimensions here. So one is the values themselves, and the second is the degree to which we hold them consistently, right? So on one hand, I think a society that's structured by mutual obligation. Now, I'm Yoruba, and in my culture, or when I was growing up, it was, yes, young people have to respect elders, but that comes with a set of obligations from elders to guide young people well, right? And we have proverbs that speak to the responsibilities both of the young, but also the responsibilities of the elder. And that sense of mutual responsibility, when you think about Nigerian politics now and where we've gotten to, where in many cases, money rules all, and resources and access rule over values and integrity, reinvigorating those cultural resources that exist in all of the major groups in Nigeria, I think will play a really big role in shaping what people ask of their representatives and what people ask of their politicians. And I think part of that comes to the second point about consistency. We have to be consistent about our values. It's not just enough to be visible or talking about them. It's actually about how we implement them in practice. Okay. Even where you maybe have issues with corruption, the question is, to what degree does society socially punish people for deviation from our values as a collective? And I think we really have to think about that. And that's also something that isn't what we can sort of outsource to leadership. It's actually something that every Nigerian can think about in their day-to-day.
Oh, wow.
As I move through the world today, did I display the values that I think should represent me?
I agree. But then again, if we wanted to start changing the narrative, just like you've been saying today, what are the first concrete steps that policymakers, educators, and even everyday citizens should actually embrace?
Well, I think there's three things I want to talk about here. I think the first is, again, I've been talking about incentive structures, right? I think as a society, we should do more of celebrating people who do the right thing. Okay. There have been some cases recently where you've seen, there was a case with an airport worker who had found some money and handed it in and was celebrated by the National the NOA. But I think we need to do more of that, because I think part of it is to make sure that Nigerians understand that hard work and integrity pays. Okay. And so that they're not sort of tempted to, I think inconsistency on that front can lead people to being kind of turning away from the values that we hold dear. I think the second dimension is really focusing on education. And it's not just about educating people so they know things that are necessary for their profession. I think there's a kind of lean towards more vocational education. I think it's also about reinvigorating our humanities, which have seen a lot of decline in recent decades, right? So putting money into and value on the faculties and the sectors of education, which are really thinking about Nigeria at a more philosophical level, and also thinking about our history, so that we can come to a position where we have more coherent and cohesive collective history. And then I think the third thing is also to celebrate our diversity more. I think that lip service is often paid to the diversity of Nigeria, but I think in practice, really what I want to see, the other day, I talked about how you very rarely see Nigerian languages directly translated between each other. So people translating directly from Yoruba to Hausa or directly. And I think oftentimes, given that concepts are very culturally specific, that kind of inter-ethnic dialogue can throw up a lot of the similarities in our cultural practices and the similarities in our collective ethos that might be missing or lost in translation when English is used as a mediator. So really, I think that it's about creating a tighter ship so that you can create the kind of social agents and actors that you need for development, with the same values and the integrity that you need for development as well.
Oh, I must commend your, sense of belonging. But then again, are there other nations you would point to, maybe in Asia or Africa, that have successfully made culture central to their development story?
I think there are a few cases. I think, even if I mentioned China in the piece, and I think that also reflects in the way that their economy has developed and the cultural resources. There are cases like, if you look at South Korea, when South Korea was dealing with a debt problem, there was a national drive. It was symbolic. Obviously, it wasn't going to pay off the debt, but people donated their own household gold towards the nation being able to pay off its international debt because of that sense of patriotism and belonging. Closer to home, if you think about countries like Tanzania, where you have a diverse nation adopting Swahili as a language in order to provide a framework. And it wasn't like it was a dominant group's language, it was a minority group's language, but they wanted to provide a cohesive framework so that they could have that intercultural dialogue outside of their colonizers' language, right? So I think it's really, it's not something that's too far-fetched for Nigerians. It's just about having the political will to implement, and also the vision and sort of inspiration to do so in an innovative way. I think people really want to see their languages protected. People really want to see their cultural identity respected. But I don't think that that is mutually exclusive from having a cosmopolitan sense of what it means to be a Nigerian.
Oh wow. Now because we're pressed for time, I could go more, on and on, but I think I should just ask you this. On a personal note, if you could leave Nigerians with one reflective thought about our ethos and our future, what would that be?
I think for me, being a Nigerian, as someone who grew up Yoruba, but also Nigerian outside of Nigeria, but is deeply committed and was always raised to be deeply committed to Nigeria, I think for me, my final note would be on patriotism.
Okay.
To be a patriotic Nigerian, to me, is not to kind of love the flag or to know the words of the anthem. To me, it's a deep commitment to everybody that is in Nigeria to play my role in developing Nigeria so that we can all have a better quality of life. And I think if more Nigerians kind of approached patriotism in that way and really thought about how their actions and their destiny is interconnected with what happens to other Nigerians. You know, if there's corruption in Nigeria, it affects us all. If there's development in Nigeria, it affects us all. If we grow as an economy, all of us stand to gain. And if we lose out as an economy, all of us stand to lose, right? So I think it really is understanding that patriotism flows from how our destinies, whether you're in Nigeria or outside Nigeria in the diaspora, are tied together. Because the perception of Nigeria and also the reality of Nigeria shape all of our lives.
Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. I believe that with you, our national image is safe. With the passion with which you speak and there's so much passion with which you want us to actually embrace, all of this to make us a better nation. I am actually very proud of you. But then before I let you go, you also touched on some of the challenges, colonial legacies, globalization, and even internal fragmentation. Which of these do you think has actually done the most damage to Nigeria's sense of self?
I think all of them are connected. We have a foundational problem, which is that we came together as a nation not by our own making, right? And every effort at making a Nigerian identity since then is structured by that problem. So what we need is consent to this Nigerian identity. It's not something that comes naturally to us as it may do for some other nations, right? And I think in our attempts to sort of get towards that place, at times we've been a little bit lackluster. And I think that's led to a lot of the internal fragmentation. I'm really concerned by the rise of cessationism that we're seeing in Nigeria. I'm really concerned by the rise of a sense that we can't share space in Nigeria. And I think much of that is down to the internal fragmentation, which stems from this fundamental colonial problem of being a nation which was once described as a geographical expression.
Oh wow, oh wow. Thank you so much for your time, Oyinkan Teriba. Oyinkan Teriba has been our guest on The Big Story. She is a researcher and a policy expert. Thank you so much for joining us on The Big Story. It's been such an awesome and very, very insightful conversation. Thank you for your time. And that's the much we will take on Big Story today. Up next is social listening. Stay with us on The Breakfast Show.